During the Cold War, Stalin used his secret police, also known as the NKVD, to enforce his terror throughout the country and gain intel in order to ensure the success of communism. The main purpose of the NKVD was to assassinate anyone who tried to revolt against Stalin or tried to create an uprising in Soviet territory. The economic department of the NKVD was responsible for combating economic sabotage in industry and agriculture.
They sent men from industrial towns, preaching of the great benefactor Stalin, to convince us to join the collective farms. We thought we were going to go to a gigantic kolkhoz with waterfalls and big feather beds, and all the food you could eat, and everything provided and everyone happy, but we were wrong.
The Soviet government sent in 25,000 industry workers and their families to convince farmers to join collectives, and if they would not, report them as kulaks to their agents.
We learned that this government, far away and unseen, was a powerful evil trying to take away everything we had. We thought Stalin was the Antichrist. They came to take our priest after they had burned his church, but we locked arms, the women in the village, and we would not let them. Because we were women, we did not get the same punishments as the men.
Peasant women were rarely accountable for their actions due to them being seen by officials as the most backwards and uneducated of the farmers. They physically blocked the entrances of huts of peasants scheduled to be exiled as kulaks and led assaults on officials.
Many people died, many people starved, were sentenced to death for trying to pick up leftover grain on the field after the harvest, and many were sent away and never returned. Even in the beginning, many authorities were lynched by angry, hysterical mobs.
In 1932, a decree was issued proclaiming that the punishment for theft from the kolkhoz was the death sentence. 125,000 people were found guilty of this offense.
Our countryside was no longer our home. The serfdom of our ancestors had come back. We could not leave either. We were bound to our land.
The deaths from starvation or disease from collectivization have been estimated from 4 to 10 million. The total death toll, both directly and indirectly, from Stalin's collectivization program was in the order of 12 million. Stalin used his secret police during the purges to purify Soviet society. Any people who were viewed as a threat were sent to the gulags. The NKVD rounded up over 1 million members of Soviet Party and sent over 10 million to the gulags during the stretch from 1934 to 1939. These men and women were often tortured for days to get them to confess so that Stalin could claim the legitimacy of these purges.
I was never associated with the torturing of the prisoners, but oftentimes I would sit in on the trials. Sometimes a prisoner would claim to be totally innocent one day and come back a few days later, all beaten and bruised, and would retract their previous statements and plead guilty to all charges.
Stalin wanted this entire operation to seem legitimate to the outside world. These fake trials required either a guilty verdict or a confession in order for Stalin to continue to receive support from the rest of the government.
Once convicted, these now criminals would either be sentenced to death, or if they were really unlucky, sentenced to hard labor in the gulags for the remainder of their lives. These unlucky souls often found themselves in the worst parts of the Soviet Union, mostly in Siberia. There, they would be underfed, overworked, and treated like subhumans. Many guards, such as myself, didn't agree with the treatment of the prisoners, but what were we to do? We certainly didn't wish to take their place.
Conditions in the gulag were incredibly poor. The prisoners would work for 16-hour days of hard manual labor. At the end of the day, if they didn't meet their quota of work, they would be given less than the already small ration of food. Eventually, these prisoners would succumb to starvation or exhaustion and die.
Stalin didn't care about these prisoners. If they died, replacement certainly wasn't an issue. He could order anyone to be sent to these terror camps at any time and use this to his full advantage.
In 1941, 2 years after the majority of the Great Purge had ended, Stalin grew weary of the Red Army, specifically the older officers in the Air Force. His paranoia led him to believe that they were plotting against him, and as a result, he began to use the NKVD to purge his own army.
In 1941, we started having to take members of the Red Army and their commanders to the gulags. In all, over 30,000 members of the Red Army were taken to the gulags, and over 50% of the officers were removed from their posts. These members of the army were quickly replaced by men of Stalin's choosing.
After removing officers and replacing them with his own people, Stalin finally felt at ease with the Red Army, but was still paranoid. After years of doing his bidding, Stalin finally decided to turn on the NKVD.
At some point after cleansing the Red Army, Stalin felt that we, the NKVD, were now the largest single threat to his chokehold of power over the USSR. We knew everything he had ordered us to do and how inhumane these actions were. He decided to send us all to the gulags, the same places we had once guarded and sent millions of people to their deaths in.
While Stalin was purging the Red Army, he was advised to begin a nuclear program. The Soviet Union was falling behind, and creating an atomic bomb would strengthen the country.
When the program first began, it was under the suggestion of nuclear physicist Georgy Flerov. Once he had realized that journals had stopped publishing information about uranium fission, he urged Stalin to start making progress on an atomic bomb. Stalin had become very paranoid and uneasy, so he collected as many physicists as he could. Thus, in 1943, the Soviet nuclear program was initiated and was led by the father of the Soviet atomic bomb, Igor Kurchatov. The leader of the NKVD and political head of the Soviet nuclear program, Lavrentiy Beria, had Gulag laborers build a test site in northeast Kazakhstan and claimed that the region was uninhabited, but in fact it wasn't. Laborers from the Gulags built the closed science city of Kurchatov, named after Igor Kurchatov, as the center of operations for the Semipalatinsk test.
Throughout the entirety of the Cold War, Stalin had spies in the US and Great Britain. The spies that provided information about nuclear weapons were known as atomic spies. Their work constitute the most publicly well-known and most documented cases of nuclear espionage in the history of nuclear weapons.
August 29, 1949, we were successful in testing our first atomic bomb, First Lightning, which, at the command of Beria, was an exact copy of the first American atomic bomb. This meant our lives and Soviet Russia was spared. However, the lives of those in the nearby villages were not. Radiation and chemical debris from First Lightning covered the nearby villages, and we were made to observe the effects that they had on the people there. The radiation that these people were exposed to was terrible and extremely horrific. Northeast Kazakhstan is not the only area that was affected by radiation. The Chagin nuclear test in 1965 created a whole radioactive lake named the Chagin Lake. After all these years, you can still see the effects of the radiation on the environment and the people surrounding the test sites.
Stalin had a reign of terror that lasted for the entirety of his ruling. He used the NKVD as the main enforcers of his brutality. Stalin would take food from the farmers to feed the industrial workers. He would send political enemies to the gulags and even began the testing of nuclear weapons. Stalin was a cruel leader who truly ruled through fear and terror.